And fidget, that's my issue.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer back with today's Social Change Career Podcast live stream. We're talking about stories that shape change, freelancing, and global development media. This is season 15, episode 4. Hard to believe it's already season 15 and almost the end of 2025. We're going to be with Emma Smith, who has many years of experience in communications development, reporting, and I'll introduce her full bio in a little bit. For people who have not joined the podcast before, we generally go about an hour, and we deeply enjoy hearing from people watching. So particularly on LinkedIn or YouTube, please put a comment where you're watching from, and feel free to share questions, comments, and a few sentences or words about your background, because it helps us. This is one of almost 200 episodes, so this will be converted to an audio episode on Friday, and you can find it at pcdn.global/listen or any podcasting platform there is. And we've done anything from impact investing to head of foundations to tech for social change to reducing gender-based violence to almost anything you can imagine, innovators from over 30 countries. So you can go and search and probably find at least 4 to 5 podcast episodes that fit your interest. And then 3 quick requests. Please follow Emma on LinkedIn and make sure you enjoy her work and look at her writing in other places. If you like the podcast or any podcast, the number one thing you can do for a podcaster is take 10 seconds and rate it and share it. So whether it's on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere, it just helps to grow reach and impact. And please follow PCDN. So Emma is a freelance journalist whose work has appeared in DevX, The New Humanitarian, and The Guardian. She's also worked within the development sector itself, first with a child rights NGO and later leading communications for a UN agency initiative. And she has a unique combination of storytelling and institutional communication. Originally from Scotland, she is now based in Barcelona and holds degrees from Glasgow Caledonian University and University of College Dublin. And just a little funny thing, there's a great show on Apple TV, has nothing to do with development, called Down Cemetery Road. So I'm not paid by Apple to do this, but we were watching an episode this morning, and a big part of it is filmed in Scotland. So, I mean, I've only been to Edinburgh, so we were talking about how beautiful Scotland is. So Emma, thank you for joining us. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. And just to start off with, when you think about your teenage years, did you envision any particular professional paths? And, was it scientist, teacher, business person? And how did you become aware of, journalism is fairly well known, but this niche of kind of development, communications, and journalism?
Well, firstly, hello to everyone listening, and thank you for having me on the podcast today. So I think I probably hadn't thought about it until recently when I was kind of thinking ahead of this conversation. I think since I was kind of probably a young teenager, journalism was what I aspired to be, probably a very glamorized version in my head of being like a war correspondent or, a foreign correspondent, something like that. I would say, of course, as I studied and became more aware of the industry and spoke to people in it, those jobs are very much glamorized and maybe not what they seem on TV. But I think when I was in high school, there was a couple of key classes that probably led me to this kind of interest in human rights, global issues. One class where we learned about apartheid in South Africa, the caste system in India, and just became a little bit more aware of these issues that were happening out with my local town and my country. And then I would say, even though I had that idea in my head when I was 17, 18, starting university, there was probably a few years where it wasn't really clear to me how I would get into that type of journalism. I studied journalism at university, and it was a very practical course, but it wasn't necessarily tailored towards global or international journalism. It was very much focused on local journalism, national TV, national radio. It was a great course and very practical. It gave me a lot of the foundations that I needed, but it didn't really give me any idea of how to get into that kind of global outlook. So I did actually go and do a master's. I was very fortunate that I was in the position I could, because I didn't have any tuition fees, so I could go on and do a master's. I know that that's a real luxury. And the master's I did was in media and international conflict. So I think it gave me a little bit of a bridge into, global media stories, how different media platforms and outlets around the world cover different stories depending on the global powers at the time or the politics of the time. And so that kind of gave me that bridge a little bit into that. I would say I still struggled because, if you're just out of university and you think, how am I ever going to break into one of these big institutions that has foreign correspondents? I think maybe the media landscape today is a little bit different. You don't need to work with a big institution like the BBC to be able to cover these topics. There's so many smaller platforms now, or still really great platforms sharing news and covering these issues that were actually not around when I was in university. I can't think of the year exactly, but when I was in uni, Twitter had just come out, and so the media landscape has changed hugely. And a lot of the jobs that exist today for journalists, or the ways that they could write and share their work, did not exist then. So I would say I took a bit of a detoured route. I am, writing the stories that I wanted to write about, but definitely did take a detour, and for a few years maybe wasn't clear how I would get here. I would say that also working for a few years, I started as a volunteer and then an intern at this child rights NGO also helped me a little bit in the bridging into the international storytelling, because there I was working with the country teams. I was working on reports and drafting reports and drafting, advocacy papers. So writing, but a different type of writing. But again, it was just exposure to different issues in different regions, working with different people. So that I think also helped me kind of give me that background to get into international journalism. I hope that answered it, because when you're thinking back to 15 years and the route that you take.
Yep. Yeah. So I think that's a very clear answer, and I guess two questions. So one is between undergrad, between Caledonian University and University College Dublin. Was that when you started working for the Child Rights NGO? That was postmasters, and then for both, when you were thinking about pursuing a master's, and for anyone today, because the landscape has changed insanely, both in terms of speed, opportunities, but also the destruction of a lot of traditional media. And so can you just reflect for the master's, like how did you pick a master's? And for people who come to you today and say, it depends if they want to work in communications or PR or journalism, but like, what are your thoughts around degrees and upskilling in terms of, the actual skills people get and how to pick a program, to weigh if it's a good option for a particular person and how to pick a program?
So on the first part of your question, I did my degree in Glasgow and then I went to Dublin for my master's. The work with the Child Rights Organisation came about when I was in Dublin. I actually was working part-time on the weekends in a cafe, and on the same street there was the offices of the Child Rights Organisation, and I just passed it enough times to then go home and look one night and see what they were doing, and then I think I just shot them an email and asked if they had any volunteering opportunities, and I volunteered probably for 6 months, and then got an internship, and then I think after that I had a few months of a non-intern kind of paid staff position. So that was how that came about. And it was kind of funny because sometimes when I was interning, I would be, in the cafe working, and my colleagues would be coming in for their coffee. And then I would head to the office in the afternoon to do a few hours of interning. But I think that speaks to, like where experiences or where opportunities can crop up from. And you just kind of have to be, on the lookout and inquisitive and inquire, where can I contribute here? On the master's, so it's tricky because I think when I graduated, there was a real kind of pressure that the thing to do if you wanted a certain career path was to go and get a master's. And certainly, I don't know if it's the same now, but a lot of NGOs, a lot of UN agencies, a lot of places where they were hiring, they would always require a master's. I'm not really sure if that's the case now. I would like to think that maybe it's not so rigid in that way. For me, I maybe did it, I would say a little bit the opposite of some people. I did the journalism degree, which was really focused and really practical. And then did, I would say, a little bit more of a general, still, in an area that I wanted to pursue, but a bit more of a general topic or a general course. I did it that way because I felt like it was more important for me to get the foundational skills of journalism first and have that 4 years. And then, it was just like a bonus to have that extra knowledge of the international global, media landscape. I would say I do know plenty of people who have done it the other way. They've studied politics or international relations or geography or languages and then gone back and done, a 1 year postgrad or a course in journalism. And I very much value the foundations and the training that I have in journalism, but I've seen it work both ways. I think it does depend though, if you want to go into PR or comms. I would say for people looking to go into comms in the sector, that journalism degree and 4 years of journalism training is not necessary. I think you can do something more general related, languages, international relations, development. I think anything that is going to require you to do research and do writing and really hone your writing skills, because I do think that's still a big part of storytelling. Even though we have social media and multimedia, a lot of it still comes down to being able to tell a story well and concisely to different audiences and tailor it to different audiences and platforms. So I think if you were looking more in the comms route or PR, you could do something a bit more general, but still probably a course that would be focused on writing and communication. I suppose now probably journalism courses are very different now to when I studied. Like I say, Twitter was just coming about. So I imagine that those courses now are probably a lot more focused on social media, multimedia, engaging on different platforms. So they could also be helpful if you're looking to do communications, because a lot of that is going to be utilizing different platforms. But I would say for storytelling in general, you don't need the journalism background. But I think if you do want to do both or do journalism primarily, then the kind of basics in journalism are very helpful. Again, I hope that answered your question. I don't know.
Oh, yes, 100%. So just a question, obviously fields are becoming somewhat merged. But just for, let's say, people who want to be clear, the difference between being a professional or freelance journalist versus a part of a communications team versus part of a PR team, if someone came to you, a young professional, and said, I love storytelling, and there's all these, of course you can go into media and film and so many, but if you just said PR, communications, and journalism, how do you differentiate those? And of course there's overlap and the skills can connect, but for someone who's thinking about, where do I use my communication, writing or video or other type of skills, how would you outline those three different areas?
Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, I would say these days, as you say, fields are increasingly merging, I think, roles and teams and organizations. And so it is sometimes something I have to clarify, like this is an interview for a journalistic piece. I think it might be easiest to explain if I kind of use examples. So for example, when I'm writing a journalistic article, we'll call it, for DevX, the New Humanitarian, it's editorially independent. So there's no kind of motive behind it. You're not trying to sway the audience one way or the other. You're reporting the facts. If you're looking at a certain issue, you're aiming to have voices from both sides of the issue. And you're always kind of looking to have a neutral stance. I'm never putting across my own opinion in those articles. Very much having maybe experts, practitioners, people in the field, Joe blogs in the street, giving both sides of the arguments, but never pursuing a certain line, which is not true. Of course, we all know that there's certain platforms or newspapers out there, and it's very clear that they have a line, especially on certain topics. And you can see that often from headlines, the language that people or platforms or publications use in their headlines, where it really skews the story and the narrative already. And for example, in these days, I do find myself quite often with NGOs having to clarify, this is an editorial independent article. We don't share the questions with you in advance because it's not a PR exercise. We want genuine insights, and we don't share the article for review beforehand. Sometimes you get that question cropping up of, you finish an interview and they say, okay, are you going to send us a PDF of this article before you print? And that's a no. I have an editor, there's a copy editor, there's a content team. The article that I write will be checked and approved by several layers of professionals, but I would never share it with the people I've spoken to, because even if, they don't disagree with what you're writing, it's more just, sometimes I didn't like how I phrased that, or I want to change how I said that. Then on the other hand, when I'm doing communications, to give an example, I was doing communications for a specific education initiative with UNESCO. And so the aim there was always really to promote the work that UNESCO were doing with partners on that education initiative, to promote the partners that were involved and what they were contributing, and mostly to promote the impact of that work. Because of course it's also tied to funding. So you're trying to show where the funding is going. So for those articles, they were news articles, but I would not call them journalistic news articles. They would be published on UNESCO's website, for example. And usually the sources in those were, UNESCO experts, or sometimes the partner organizations that we spoke to. And there was never like a theme or a topic of debate or an issue. It was more around like a project and promoting the work that had been done and the impact. And it's also about where they're published. So those would be published in UNESCO. And of course, maybe there, as a comms team, you're looking for an external publication or platform to pick up on this project and then pursue that potentially in a news article. But the objective as the comms person is more to promote the work that the team has been doing, or the partners, and the impact of that work. I hope that clarifies. There's way more to it, of course, but
Yes.
hopefully that.
And can you talk about, let's say, when you wrote your first substantial journalistic piece? So was it part of a full-time role? You met someone and they invited you, you pitched somebody, and if you feel comfortable, like, I mean, you may not, but like, what was the story about? And just kind of like the excitement of doing it, but also realizing there's challenges. So, like, how did you start, or how did you get your first 5 pieces? Like, were you hired in a journalistic role, or like you had a role and you were doing it freelance?
So again, I would say the landscape has changed a little bit. I mean, it could be that, 15 years ago when I was applying for my first kind of journalism roles, there probably was, or, there were plenty of freelance journalists out there. But I think, coming straight from university and a master's, you maybe had a portfolio that included university magazine or university newspaper cuttings and a couple of blogs that you had written, because blogs were around at that time. But I didn't have a portfolio of published work. So I would say that is an initial barrier if you were saying, hey, I've got this idea, I want to write about this, but you don't have something published with a name that has some kind of value and recognition. So my first articles came about in a role. I was doing careers and recruitment reporting for DevEx, and writing about careers and recruitment in the sector. The articles there tended to be more practical focused, news or features articles for the career account audience about like job opportunities in the sector. I would say then maybe to focus on like one of the first articles that I wrote that was a little bit out of that space that kind of stays in my mind. I was continuing to cover the careers and recruitment beat, but I had also started working under another editor and kind of expressed that I would be interested in writing about other things. And, if there was any opportunities, or if there was a day where they were short and needed someone to cover something. And I also felt that maybe there wasn't a dedicated reporter at that time covering mental health. And it kind of, I guess, all came around that then COVID hit, and there was, I guess, probably I got a press release from the organization, but there was an organization had put out this press release about their staff who were working on boats off the coast of Italy, where they were housing migrants who had arrived, but obviously had to go through 2 or 3 weeks of quarantine before they could even be processed. And so the story was actually, I had to conduct all the interviews remotely, obviously, but I did the story about the staff who were then also committing to spending 3 weeks on the boat at the time in order to carry out their work, because this was when COVID measures were really strict and you had to do this kind of 3-week bubble thing. I did remote interviews for this. And I think why it sticks in my head was because it was quite an emotional piece. because I was talking to humanitarian workers who were spending 3 weeks confined on a boat, which is probably not easy for anyone. And I mean, we all remember how COVID and lockdown was. So if you're trapped on a boat with, I guess, hundreds of people, you don't have a lot of space to kind of do activities or a lot of things to occupy your mind. And so these humanitarian workers who were on the boat and also trying to help the people on the boat through health issues or social and psychological issues, and kind of mental health and well-being initiatives. So I did all my interviews for that remotely, and it just so happened that there was photographs available, I think from a photographer who had been there previously. And so there was some really amazing photos, which made the piece, I think, made it just, look so much better. But that's one story that kind of stuck in my head because it was the first time I was deviating a little bit from the beat that I had written about for 4 years. And it was also quite an emotional story and kind of topical for the time. One other one that stuck out but came about a very different way, which is why I'll mention it. A few years ago, I traveled to Ghana and was kind of just traveling around and visited a community, which was kind of like a community built on stilts in this huge lake. Really beautiful and picturesque looking, but they had this issue that they just could never get staff to stay in the community to teach in the school there because there was just a lot of fears about where it was situated and, this huge body of water. And I stayed there for a couple of nights, and I didn't go with the intention of writing an article about it. But when I came back from that trip in Ghana, I think this is also an example of the kind of pitching lifestyle. I probably pitched 10 different articles from my trip to Ghana, which I would say none of them were particularly researched in advance because I wasn't going there on a reporting trip. And the one that stuck was a story about this this community, this school in Ghana that was kind of built on stilts. And so I managed to get a piece commissioned with The Guardian on that one. But it came about in a very different way. I was a freelancer. I had just traveled there kind of off my own back. I had to pitch the idea. I think the editor came back and we had to refine the pitch a little bit. That was how I got that one pitched. And again, I was very fortunate at the time that a photographer, it just so happened, The Guardian were like, oh, actually a photographer who's freelance just pitched us some photos from there. So it all kind of came together. And again, the photos were beautiful. So those are probably two examples. I would say the first one highlighting, even if you kind of feel you're pigeonholed in writing about one area, you can express interest to kind of write about something else. You can work with different editors. And then when the opportunity comes up, go for it. Or the other way, as a freelancer pitching something, which doesn't always have a high success rate.
Yeah, it's interesting. A friend of ours who helps us with PCDN just was in a place like that in rural Colombia, where it's mostly Afro-Colombian, everything's built on stilts. And he was showing us lots of pictures. There's also a lot of challenges around health and water access and sanitation, but it's also incredibly beautiful.
Right.
So a couple of questions here. So one is, I'm just thinking I've done a good amount of I've had lots of different roles, but I've consulted sometimes for donors or in evaluations or assessments. And so people will put me, there's being the expat or the white dude, but sometimes if I'm affiliated with an institution, there's this expectation of how people will interact with me because they know I'm either doing an evaluation assessment or I'm not necessarily the one in charge of funding, but they know they see that. And so when you are in your journalism role, how do you define your role, and how do you think people, whether it's in Scotland or Ghana or anywhere in the world, are people always, one is you're trying to pitch to publishers, but are you always being pitched? If you're in a cafe and someone finds out you're a journalist, someone I've got a story, or you should go look at this. So that double side of being pitched at and pitching and how people perceive you.
The person who pitches the most stories to me is my mom. Everything, we'll drive past somewhere in Scotland that there's huge litter, and she'll be like, Emma, you should write about this. Sometimes people do that thing. Even just friends, or when you're having conversations oh, you should write about this. I think the thing that you maybe have to explain is there is a difference between a topic and an angle. So, even if something is an interesting topic, there has to be a kind of organic and timely angle to it that would make somewhere say yes to your commission. And also sometimes there's a lot of interesting topics out there, but they have been written about. So yeah, I think that's one thing. And then yeah, it's also a bit of a mixture. Occasionally, I think places will reach out, usually based on your geographic location, your proximity to a story. I haven't had this experience so much, but I know I have friends based in different corners of the world. For example, one friend in Thailand. So when something awful happens there, like the floods at the moment, some UK or Irish based radio stations or platforms will reach out to her to kind of contribute to their news coverage. It sometimes happens that there's also you'll get a lot of kind of PR pitches and press releases that are not always terribly relevant. So yeah, they're not always particularly useful. I think the other thing is, so when I was at university and obviously in Scotland, there used to be this thing of you had to, they said at the time, kind of put the kilt on the story. So you had to make the story relevant to the Scottish audience, which applied to when you were covering overseas stories. And I guess that is for years why so many institutions would have like their British correspondent going and covering humanitarian disasters or conflicts overseas, and then reporting it back in a way to the audience in a way that resonated with them. And so, yeah, that was also what we kind of learned. That is still true, I think. But I think there's also a bit of a shift in focus now for similar to localization in the global dev sector. There's a focus or a push within journalism for local people to report the stories, which does change things for journalists like myself. So sometimes, yeah, I have pitched stories and, the places come back and said, oh, we would prefer this to come from a local journalist, which I completely support and understand. They have a historical and cultural context that I don't have. So I think that is changing a little bit the way that, yeah, journalists like myself maybe cover issues, especially in development. I did go to a conference years ago and there was a lot of panels on this, and one of the panelists had said, one way to still cover these development issues is to look at like the implications of your own government on these issues. And usually, in the US, I'm sure as well, and in Europe, our governments are involved in some way. There's some policy or treaty or agreement around migration or food or exports that is not helping but hindering a development issue. So it's something I'm going to try and work more in the year ahead, because I'm quite interested in covering, the migration from West Africa to Spain. And obviously being based in Spain, there is this deadly route from West Africa to here. And so I would like to cover more migration issues, but I realize that I have to cover them from a lens of, okay, I am a white Westerner based in Spain, and how do I cover them from here in a way that makes sense for me, and also doesn't take away from the potential of a local journalist. So I think there's also that aspect, yeah, based on where you are in different places. Although then some of my journalist friends and I talk about, then am I qualified now to cover Scottish stories because I haven't lived there for 15 years? So I think it can depend on the story, the publication, the point of view from which you're writing. But yeah, maybe the kind of persona or the way that you're perceived changes a little bit based on where you are.
So a follow-up question. Johan Galtung is one of the founders of Peace Studies, and I had him as a professor as part of his network. He died, unfortunately, a few years ago, and he was a mathematician by training. And I remember at one point, and he wrote 1 million books. I mean, I've done a few edited books, and he used to say, like, he had one book in his hand, one book in his heart, one book in his head. And so I'm just thinking from your journalism, like, if you're in the journalism role, how many stories, I mean, there's one is like, are you carrying a notebook or a note-taking app or a recorder? And like every week, are you generating like 1 million ideas or like, and you always have one or two things I'm just like, how does that work for you as a journalist? I'm sure everyone has their own style, but like the number of ideas and how many you actively are pursuing versus worth thinking about versus like just out of the box ideas and you put them somewhere.
Right. I like to have a notebook. Again, that was from when I was in university. We had notebooks that specifically flipped like this on the top, and the reason for that was because we still learn shorthand for when you were doing courtroom reporting or when you were in an interview where you couldn't have a recording device. So the idea was you wrote shorthand and flipped the pages really quickly. So I still like to have my little notebook with me, and it is just riddled with scribbles and notes that, yeah, sometimes ideas come and you jot them down. I think I tend to have a kind of short-term ideas, like these are the ones that I'm going to pursue in the next couple of weeks and research and pitch in the next couple of weeks. And then longer term, whether because, sometimes stories that are going to take a lot more legwork or that are a little bit unfamiliar territory, or you're not familiar with where you're going to pitch them. So I very much have like a long-term and a short-term list. Quite often I have ideas that you scribble down, you maybe pitch them, it's not successful, and you think, okay, I'll maybe come back to that in a few months, or if there's a timely news hook that comes up, I'll circle back to that idea. In terms of how quickly they come, I mean, at the moment I'm having a particularly busy, I think I'm in the middle of writing 6 or 7 articles, which, yeah, some of them are a little bit more urgent than others. Some of them are going to publish in January. Some are looking to publish in the next couple of weeks. So yeah, about 6 or 7 on the go, which does involve kind of balancing research, outreach for interviews, finding the right people in interviews for all of those before you get to the writing part. I think in terms of ideas, it kind of comes in dribs and drabs. There'll be a couple of weeks where you could sit down and I look at my notepad and I can't think of anything new. Or, you're just kind of really, not coming up with anything great. And then all of a sudden you could have a conversation with someone. It could be an interview you're doing with someone for a story, or just someone you get talking to, or you see something in the street, you go to an event or a demonstration, and suddenly you come back with like 3 or 5 ideas. Not all of those are going to pan out, but I always scribble them down and then kind of try to whittle it down to which one of these ideas on this topic is kind of got legs, and do a little bit of research to identify that. So I think, there can be, I guess, like all things, there can be really slow weeks, and then there can be weeks where a lot of ideas come to you and you're like, I can't get to these fast enough. It's too many things to pursue at one time. So then you do have to say, I think also in that case, you have to kind of think about, which ones have a news hook and are very timely? Mm-hmm. Like which ones are you going to regret if you sit on them for a month and then something changes and, you've missed the boat, and which ones you can kind of leave and pursue in a month or 2 months.
So a question, a friend of mine, this is going back a million years ago, but we worked together at an international development organization. I was one of her bosses. And eventually they went for a master's in journalism overseas. I won't go into all the details. And they came back, and this wasn't international development. I mean, the organization worked out, but she got a job as a community beat reporter. And the number of articles and this is like super tech, the number of articles she had to produce per week and the salary, and she gave it up. So I'm just curious, both of you think from the freelance or, full-time journalism or communications, can you talk a little bit about that pressure? So if someone is fortunate enough to land a job, I mean, whether it's at DevX or Politico doesn't do so much development, or, The Guardian or any, El País or, any of the major papers or TVs, but what is it like to have that pressure? And then, or as a freelance, to pay the bills and just keep things going, what is the pressure if someone wants to go into this and they don't have that much experience? What is there's the wonder if you get to do amazing things, but the pressure, the instability side.
Yeah. I think the pressure when you're a staffer somewhere can differ depending on whether you're on the news beat, which is when you could be potentially turning around like a story a day or 2 stories a day. They could be short, 400 to 600 words, but they still have to be researched and fact-checked and accurate. And I will admit, I don't like that pressure. The times when I have worked somewhere where you have to turn a story around in a day, I never really enjoyed that level of pressure. And then if you're maybe not on such a strict news beat, you're doing features or a combination of news or features, you will probably still have a target. I can't say, what it would generally be, but 2 or 3 articles a week, maybe. I'm trying to think of the last place I worked. I think it was, yeah, kind of like 3 articles a week. Those were not news articles. They were slightly longer, maybe 3 or 4 interviews for each piece. And so there is still a little bit of pressure because sometimes the issue is just, lining up the people to speak to you quickly. Again, it depends on how urgent the piece is, or if you have a little bit of lead time and you can do interviews over a week for the piece to publish next week. So I think the pressure for staffers differs depending whether they're news, breaking news, or doing features. I would say I much more prefer the pace of features. And then, yeah, of course, as a freelancer, I don't have that pressure coming from like an editor or a boss saying 3 articles a week or, 2 events or whatever a week. But you have the pressure of X many articles to pay the bills. So I will say that when I went freelance, I did actually reach out to another journalist based here in Barcelona who was a little bit more senior and had written for some of the big kind of broadsheet names. And I met with him, and his advice was to keep a comms gig or to keep a steady gig on the side, which he did, even though, when I looked at him, I thought, oh, he's got 30 years experience and is a really well-known name. He still had a couple of clients that, he would do little steady translation, ghostwriting for books, things like this. So I would say for the kind of mental well-being aspect of it, I like to have a comms gig or a steady gig on the go where you know that you're at least meeting X amount of your rent. Otherwise, you have this pressure. And it's also hard to calculate because in journalism, rates can be very different. Some places will pay you a rate per word, and that can hugely differ between like 20 cents a word to 50 cents a word to $1 is really like an amazing rate if you can get that. Other places will offer you 200 or 300 per article. Some places will offer you 50 to 80 per article. So it's not easy to say if I write 10 articles, I cover my rent, because it really depends who you're writing for. So I personally, I like to have a bit of a steady earner on the side, whether that's a comms gig with an organization like an NGO or something like that, or just kind of a commitment with an editor of maybe 1 piece per week that I'm doing for them, or 1 day per week editing, which I'm doing at the moment with a platform. Just 1 day a week per editing, 1 day per week, editing, and also helping, with 1 or 2 events a month. And even if that's not a long-term agreement, for a few months, I know that I have that coming in. I find that like taking that mental load off actually leaves more space for creativity and thinking and pitching. Otherwise, I find personally that I get really like bogged down in going for the things where you know how much money you're going to make, instead of actually pitching the things that you want to and the things that you want to write about, or maybe doing the trip or the press trip or the going to the event that you want to, because you're just so bogged down in like, how do I cover my expenses? So different levels of pressure based on how if you thrive under pressure. Maybe you'd be great on the news beat of a staff or an organization where you're a staffer and every day go in and it's that pace all day. Freelancers, I do think you definitely have to have a little bit of like self-motivation. And I do try and sometimes write goals of like, okay, this month X many news articles, 3 features, 1 event, to try and kind of guide you. But yeah, you definitely need a little bit of a get up and go. And you have to sometimes put a little bit of pressure on yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked for lots of organizations, started other ones, and there's one I started, won't go into all the details, with 5 friends, and we got up to about, it was an NGO, we got up to like 400,000 in revenue, and then we're like, we were gonna make it, and in the end, it was full-time work for half-time pay with no benefits, and there was nobody to point at, because we all collaborated, and I burnt out. I mean, I burnt out multiple times, but that was horrible.
Yeah.
So a question here. I mean, just thinking, I do publish and I do write. Not newspaper articles, but I actually almost always I have a writing process where it's like I have lots of ideas, and then trying to narrow down the idea, whether it's a blog or blogs I can do in a second, but like if it's more academic writing, I suffer and like, torture myself. I mean, not literally, but like, and then, there's a process and there's a writing block, and then eventually you just do it. And then there's editing. And so and then like the last consultancy I did, it was part of a team, but with the team there was multiple rounds of editing and feedback. And then actually, I've never had this before. We went through line by line for every single word. It was like a 40-page. It was interesting. I learned. So can you just talk about like, do you find a lot of joy in the write? I mean, there's the research and the talking, the conceptualization, there's the final piece. How do you deal with that challenges? And you might not have that. Like some people don't have.
Oh, yeah.
How do you deal with it? And your advice for people who are trying to, whether it's write a paper for university or a newspaper article or a blog, like your tips for how you've learned how to deal with that challenge.
First of all, I will say I do get writer's block. I would actually say I'm having it right now with one article that I'm doing where I've ended up interviewing 8 or 9 different UN agencies. And it's just like, now I have reams and reams of interviews, and how do you condense that? So I think, yeah, I get writer's block when it's kind of like you don't know the starting point, right? Because you just have so much information, so many interviews, so many quotes, data points. It maybe sounds silly and not that helpful, but I actually think it just helps to get words down on the page. And a lot of the time I might end up deleting half of those words, or when I'm really stuck like that, what I do is I'll write a first draft and I know it's not great, but I'm just getting the words down. I'm getting the quotes in that I want to. And then I'll go back through it and I'll kind of do like that, like a line by line. I'll go back through it and almost like improve every phrase or change every phrase. But yeah, just get everything on the page initially. For me anyway, that's how it works. Other journalists maybe have different methods, but I just like to have all the text, all the quotes in the document that I want in there, and then go through. And, quite often at the end, I'll completely restructure it and move things around. I also once had an editor who did that kind of line by line. I mean, most articles or most editors will do a line by line edit, but maybe not talk you through it. But I did have an editor once who would kind of talk me through the line by line edits. And it was actually a really helpful experience. And I think I learned a lot. And now that I'm doing some editing of other people's work, I still have her voice in my head, and like I'm trying to apply some of those things. But it's very hard to edit your own work in that way, I would say. But yes, I definitely have, those issues with writer's block. I would say the same for academic writing or, doing comms work as well, whether you're doing a report or you're trying to put together like a press release. Or the other thing I've had really bad writer's block was when I was writing speeches for, like I had to write a speech for, a UN leadership kind of presentation. How am I supposed to know what the person is saying? We have interview your data points, right? So again, just get everything to the page. And I tend to say, what we take a break, something else, and then come back to the page, which is a mess. And then kind of work through paragraph by paragraph, line by line, move things around. And then I would say I also do like kind of like an editorial read of my own articles several times. I'll go through it and every time find something that I've missed the time before. And I remember one editor once told me, like change the font, change the size of the writing, open it in different ways to kind of see it in different ways. And yeah, almost every time you'll catch a word or a comma that you want to change, and hopefully you get it to a good enough shape that then it goes to another editor and they will inevitably find some little things that you've missed as well, or be able to say, okay, we could phrase it like this. I think one of the biggest things that I try to do, and maybe where I've seen, when I'm doing comms work, is to write concise, like, not take 20 words when you can say it in 10. And I think that's something probably a lot of comms people do when they're helping, like the technical experts in these organizations are the experts in their fields, and they know really well their projects and the impact and data points, but they tend to write maybe in a very jargon-filled way or in a very policy type way, which is really long and wordy. And, for most audiences, unless it's a policy maker type audience, most audiences that is not going to work. So it's trying to write things in an engaging way that is translatable to different audience. And usually that means writing quite concisely. So I think also when I'm doing my final reads of my articles, I'm looking at like, oh, what have I said in a really wordy, clunky way that I could write better. But I will say, there's still absolutely so many things I learn every week, every time I submit an article, every time I work with a different editor. I think, yeah, it's something I can always be improving on is my writing.
Yeah, I mean, I still have writer's block, and it's not for emails or blogs, but it's like academic or policy writing, and I've been doing it for a long time. But it's not my joy. But I've learned.
It,
Go
it
ahead.
is my joy, and that's why actually recently I've had a few conversations when people are like, "Oh, now with AI, you must be able to write so many more articles."
Mhm.
But AI, I'm a little bit of an AI skeptic, and I definitely would not trust it to write and fact check and edit an article. But I do enjoy the writing when you get going, after
Yeah.
you've got over the writer's block. I do enjoy that part. So I don't want to give that to AI.
Yeah, there is always this moment of like flow, and then like yeah. So, and I use AI a lot, but there's a tool I use. I won't say which one, but I may use lots of tools, but there's one that's really good at helping me edit. So it's like not, yeah, I can use AI to generate everything, but then most of the time it doesn't sound right, and there's a lot of fake citations. But there's a tool I use where often I'll post in a paragraph or a whole page or two, or and say like help, and it goes through line by line, and it says like you can improve this word. This is so it's almost like Microsoft Word, but a billion times better because it's actually helping. So that
Yeah.
I find it really helpful. So a question is the if you think about your own work, your editors, or whether you've been in full time or freelance role, how do you think about like the impact? I mean, there's like the dream that whether it's Watergate or the scandals with UN troops in Haiti or the DRC or anywhere, there's lots of scandals and challenges, and sometimes that reporting leads to change. But how do you when you were being trained in journalism or when you talk to peers? Like how do you I mean obviously doing a good story is incredibly beneficial, but then there's like, so what do you hope happens, or sometimes can you show that you help contribute to something and that something might have changed?
So yeah, I think when I was training and even now when I talk to peers, the aspiration or the dream is always that, yeah, as you say, you break a really important story that changes the course of history, or your reporting maybe leads to changes at a policy level, funding level. Um, those are of course quite dreamy ideas, maybe one day, but it's not something that I've achieved yet. I think for me, yeah, of course, there's all these metrics: likes, clicks, shares, reads, read through. Um, I remember when I used to work somewhere and they measured all these metrics. I mean, some articles get a lot of clicks and opens, but nobody actually reads through the course of it, because we all have such a short attention span now. For me, I think it's more sometimes, someone reaches out and says, "Oh, that was a great article." For me personally, I like it when someone says, "Oh, I didn't know about this," and so they've learned about a new issue, or even just keeping something in the limelight, keeping in the news cycle, raising awareness or keeping awareness of a topic. I think that's maybe more like a realistic goal for the impact I would like to have. In terms of, yeah, measuring that, it would maybe be more through, yeah, people reaching out to say, "I read your article," or "really like this," or "really, triggered my interest in this." There, I guess, can also be small ways, and this probably sounds a bit like braggy, but it's just an example of one time I wrote an article about the use of NDAs by NGOs in the nonprofit sector to kind of silence whistleblowers. And it was then referenced, and I actually don't remember how I found out it was referenced, but it was referenced at like a parliamentary committee meeting in the UK, which was on that topic. So it was also, I definitely did not change the course of history with that, but there was obviously a conversation at the time going on about that. And so it was referenced in that conversation. And so I remember feeling like, okay, I must have done something right. I must have spoken to the right people or pursued the right kind of questions with this article. As I say, the conversation around the NDs was already happening, and it's not that I, broke that story. But yeah, for policy makers or those kind of people to have been reading it, I'm not saying it made any impact on them whatsoever, but I kind of thought, okay, you must have done something right there. And so that's maybe like a concrete way to measure it. But I think for a lot of stories, yeah, that's not the case, not possible. So it's really more about hoping that, yeah, at least a few people read it and enjoy it or find it interesting, or maybe become more interested in a
Mhm.
cause, a topic, a challenge, a region, something like that.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, and non-disclosure agreements, in Silicon Valley, and non-compete clauses. There's so, you know, I mean, there has been thankfully a lot more press and some changes. Whether it's sexual
Yeah.
harassment or just you can't work for a competitor or whatever. Like, there's a lot of. So related question. I mean, the development industry has a lot of beauty and wonder and incredible things, and also tons of dysfunction and power dynamics and the search for funding. So when you're reporting, whether it's on a development project or an organization, how do you balance? Because development's under attack. Like, basically, a
Mm.
lot of things in the world that would help the world are under attack in many countries. I mean, obviously, the
Yeah.
destruction. So how do you balance that need to stay kind of balanced, critical, but also, like, if someone writes an article, there was that book from like 15 years ago, Dead Aid. I forgot the author. Or, like, I've used William Easterly's books, and I really like his writing. There is that debate. Like, I mean, there's all kinds of development, but some people say big development just doesn't do much. So how do you balance like that? It's a hard question, but, like, to show challenges and critiques, but also, if you're in the industry, like,
Yeah.
not, hope at least continues to succeed wherever possible and get funding.
So yeah, I think, yeah, as a journalist, again, I will always have my own opinion on these issues, but that should never come through in the article. I think the way that I try, hopefully successfully, to balance is really a range of sources. So that might be, for some stories, you might, only need to talk to 3 or 4 people, and you've got a good balance of people in the yes, people in the no, people in the middle. Some you might have to talk to 10, to get that balance. I think it is, yeah, you do maybe have to be careful, because obviously if I am interviewing, which I often am, people who work in the development sector, they're working in NGOs, they're not going to too openly criticize the sector that they work in. But I would say there is an awareness, and people are maybe increasingly, or in the last years, a little bit more open to talking about the flaws of the sector. I'm working on one story at the moment, which, yeah, we'll hopefully publish in a couple of weeks. And it's about something quite topical and tied to like fundraising revenue. And so far I've had a few interviews, and I can see they're all very much on the one side. And so basically saying like, this is bad. So I am very cautious, and I have to try and find a couple of balancing interviews. But in saying that, even some of those people that I have spoke to, they have acknowledged, the good and the bad, because they're also professionals in the sector, right? And again, I think it's about the diversity of sources. So not just practitioners and people, leadership from NGOs, but also academics sometimes can be great. People, researchers at universities or programs, think tanks, they can offer a little bit more of a neutral view, because they're studying it and they're looking at the data, but they're maybe not like too swept up in the day-to-day of working in an NGO, for example. Then also a lot of networks, whether it's networks for like NGOs or different movements. And then I think networks from, or organizations and voices from different regions, because, yeah, of course, usually if you're interviewing primarily leadership teams in the US, you're going to get one type of opinion. So I think, yeah, I'm also trying to be cautious of this. And I think probably more widely across the sector, people are trying to be cautious of making sure that they have voices from different regions and continents and different types of organizations. I think that's another thing I have to be cautious of sometimes, because sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's easier to get a statement from like the big NGO that has a comms team that send out press releases, and you email them, and they can give you a statement or an interview with whoever. And it can be a little bit harder sometimes to do the research and find some small, maybe obscure seeming social awareness or social justice or some, movement organization that has very valid opinions, but takes a little bit more work to find them. They might not have a media team or that you can contact. So you're just kind of emailing their general email address and hoping that you can connect with the right person. So sometimes it's just a little bit more work and research to make sure that you have a really like a diverse range of voices. And I mean, I guess there are some issues where the opinion is maybe going to be overwhelmingly on one side. A lot of the things of the last year, I'm sure with the aid cuts, there was quite an overwhelming opinion on one side of that. But you could always find people who could then say, the only silver lining of this whole thing is, so you could usually still find a balance.
So just we'll start to wrap up. A couple of more questions. So since you've also done a lot of work just on careers in the field, the average age of our podcast tends to be, let's say, 25 to 40, but we have younger and older. And just for people who are thinking about career and development in general, obviously, USAID is gone and it's not coming back. And FCDO and some European funders are cutting back, not all. So just like, what are your thoughts of, because the number of people being laid off, and it's not just in development, it's the tech sector, and so many organizations are downsizing. There still is hiring. So just your thoughts in general on, I haven't seen the state of the humanitarian field, like I forget that's Alnet, like every few years there's a report, and I haven't seen that since the destruction. The last one's maybe 2024, but just like your thoughts, like, are there still jobs here? And obviously I'm not asking you to talk about the meta, and also like, do you see, there's always going to be jobs for fundraisers, and not always, but like I see so many organizations that are putting their hopes, and a lot of it's unrealistic. Like, we want someone to come in and fundraise, I think it's unrealistic, not all, but there's like, where do you see growth and where do you see contraction? And obviously it's geographic, sector, and skill specific, but any just thoughts?
Yeah, so this might be a long answer. And interestingly, it's something that I'm working on with DevX in the next couple of weeks as we're doing our like end of year wrap up. We are going to put together like a downloadable using our data, like looking at where there has still been hiring, which regions, what kind of jobs, and trying to use that to predict where there will be jobs in the year ahead. As you say, it very much depends on the type of work, the region. I sympathize, because I can't really imagine if you're just coming out of university, beyond doing that volunteering, which I did, where I was basically addressing envelopes and licking stamps 200 times over. I can't really imagine now where you go as, just out of college or university. You don't have any experience. How do you get a job without experience? And you're probably at that stage, you're also not going to be able to land a consultancy role, right? Because I think more and more we're seeing jobs that are consultancy roles. Organizations don't want to hire full time yet, or like long-term staff roles, but you need a certain level of experience to do consultancy work. So yeah, I think it is really tricky for recent grads or more junior professionals. From the work that I've been doing with DevX on this topic and speaking to experts about this, a lot of it was around looking for organizations more locally that you can contribute to, local charities, NGOs, or even kind of, local government-led initiatives. It's maybe not as glamorous as you thought, or, maybe not what you had in mind as in global development, but you could still probably do a lot of those same tasks, learn those same skills that hopefully in the future there will be opportunities for you in the global development space that will use those same skills. I think then maybe at like a slightly more middle professional level, there are opportunities, but very much in certain role types. I recently wrote about there are opportunities in fundraising and revenue focused roles, because every organization is thinking, how do we make more money and how do we diversify our funding? So there was, there's roles around that. Something that I, came out of that was, if you have been working for 10 or 20 years with institutional funders, USAID, FCDO, your expertise isn't so relevant now, because organizations aren't looking for that kind of funding anymore. They want people, from my reporting so far, they want people who can engage with influencers or, use social media or do digital campaigns and kind of, I guess, bring a new way. So we're also looking at how like communication, revenue, fundraising roles, business development roles. I think there are opportunities, maybe consultancy based in all these areas, but definitely about bringing a new perspective to it. So that might involve like repackaging your old skills. And then I think there is reason for optimism in some regions. I did an article recently about the global development job market shifts in Africa, and I was actually quite like pleasantly optimistic when I spoke to people there. They said there's a lot of opportunities there in fintech, in tech, in AI. Jobs utilizing AI. A lot of jobs with different types of funders around climate and sustainability or health, climate health. There was kind of optimism there that, also that more jobs were perhaps allowing locals who previously maybe wouldn't have had so much leadership or senior roles, but like locals there were now able to really be the experts and lead those projects. So yeah, I guess it depends on where you're based, if you're looking to work overseas or work in your own kind of backyard, as they say. But I think for professionals based in the US or in Europe and in these countries, the advice is very much like look closer to home and look how you can contribute to local organizations or work in local governance. Because maybe just not the same kind of development or overseas jobs. But yeah, as I say, it's something we're working on, and maybe by the end of the year or January, there will be some more insights on this, but hopefully it's not going to be too pessimistic, the outlook for 2026.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, and please follow DevX. They have a lot of free content. You can also subscribe. Paid content, and does a lot. They do a lot of really good original reporting on so many different beats and just jobs and funding. So, just 3 quick questions as we wrap up. So, for people who want to follow you, and just also for people who are kind of doing comm in general, do you have a portfolio page? Like, do you recommend, do you have your own website? And do you recommend anyone trying to work with, whether it's podcasting, video, written, that people do like a simple portfolio page? And do you have a favorite platform that you use or others that you might recommend?
Yeah. I post on LinkedIn, but I do have a platform, a portfolio online, a site called Journal Portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
There is a free version, but I do pay something, I think like $3 or $4 or euros per month for the upgraded version, which I think just allows you to do things a little bit easier. But yeah, I think I would very much recommend having a portfolio. When you're pitching to publications or platforms, they're going to want to see what you've written before, but also if you're applying to comms jobs, just to show that you can write. I would very much advise having a portfolio, because also just to keep track of what you're doing, right? And also you never know if a site that you have written for might crash one day or disappear. So just to have an archive of all your articles. I would recommend having an online portfolio, and there's a whole bunch out there, probably more and more every week, but that's the one that I've used for years and like.
Okay. Yeah, and with AI website builders too, you can put together something and link to the article.
Even some now I've seen that they automatically upload anytime you publish something. It like takes it from the web and uploads it automatically. The one I use, I still like go in and paste the link, but there are some that like automate that whole process now. Yeah.
If people are interested in you as a journalist or comms person, just like what is the people get in contact on LinkedIn, but like what are the, not to pitch, but like what are your areas of specialty, or where are you most excited about contributing?
So yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best place, or you can go to my portfolio, and I think my email address is on there. I made a decision to not have any other socials, because then I just found that I ended up doom scrolling more news at night. Those are the best places to reach me. I would say, I have extensive experience now in reporting careers and recruitment in the development sector. So that is something that I can always discuss and write about. The other areas that particularly excite me right now are around migration, because I think there's so many different stories when we see the headlines about migration, but there's so many more stories that feed into that, and so I'm really excited, hopefully, about writing more around that area, and then also a little bit niche, but looking at agreements between European and West African countries around food and fishing sustainability. So those are 2 areas that I'm excited about right now. If people wanted to get in touch, but I've also covered, gender and women's rights, health, women's health, mental health, food security, different aspects of development. And, they're always going to be interesting and important, I think.
Okay. And then the last 2 questions, some resources as you were talking, I was thinking the Rory Peck Trust Solutions Journalism Network. But where do you go? I mean, like, and Pulitzer Center and Crisis Group Pulitzer Center, like, some of them have funding or
Yeah.
scholarships or training or the Reuters Institute. But like, where do you go just to be inspired, informed, or just kind of, is it International Center, International Center for Journalists? Like, where do you
Yeah.
go, or what newsletters or podcasts, just to kind of be inspired and informed?
So yeah, all of those main ones that you've mentioned, but I think from LinkedIn, it's so easy every week that you discover another maybe smaller niche platform that does journalism grants, maybe in specific areas. So uh, climate, I see a lot of journalism grants around climate reporting, climate health, climate sustainability. But yeah, they're not always very well known ones like the Pulitzer grants, which I've looked at. But I think from LinkedIn, journalists sharing, oh, here's an opportunity to apply. So I would say that LinkedIn, I suppose on Twitter or X, you would also see these same opportunities. I actually signed up for a few journalism newsletters, which are not specific to development, but I get a couple every week where it's basically a roundup of all the calls that editors have put online in one place or another, saying we're looking for stories around this. I might not always have a story at that moment to pitch, but it's a good way to learn about publications, platforms, particularly smaller, less well-known ones, but that might be very relevant. And editors, to get the name of an editor and their email address so that when you do have an idea, you can pitch them. And I would also say, actually, I've been really enjoying recently LinkedIn for just like general insights on things like this might be helpful for like comms people or journalists. Like the other week I saw on LinkedIn, someone had written a fairly lengthy post, but it was kind of looking at the language we use still in global development. So things like on mission and like the kind of colonial roots of some of the phrases we still look. So I think LinkedIn can be pretty good sometimes at you, I guess, the algorithm at kind of highlighting to you the posts that will be relevant and interesting. And I do rely on LinkedIn quite a lot because I don't have other socials, whereas I know a lot of other journalists do use Instagram, for example, quite a lot to follow stories, to engage with organizations or people, or just, for inspiration. On an old school level for inspiration, I love, it's like a real treat at the weekend to go and buy a magazine in my hand. So I quite like buying like the Guardian magazine, which is like a roundup of all the news of the week, but they also do have a pretty decent like global development coverage. And it's just nice sometimes to have, a newspaper article or magazine in your hand and the images. And then, also, National Geographic, these kind of more visual magazines. For me, I find those like quite inspiring because sometimes you read these like long form investigative features with these amazing photos and you think that is what I want to write, like this article that probably took months, but this is the kind of thing that I aspire to write. Those are the ones kind of coming to me off the top of my head. There's probably a lot more.
Yeah, and we'll put those all in the show notes so people can find them. And also rest of world, I love.
Rest of the world, yeah. And again, I would highlight them for their one that they really like stories from local journalists. So, for example, I've pitched to them stories before around like tech disposal and these dumps in Ghana that are full of all our technology from Europe and the US, but they really like local reporting. So for people based in those countries, that could be also a good one to pitch to. But they also do great stories.
Yeah. And then unfortunately, Global Press Institute's closing, but they've done amazing work around the world. And they also put together guides and train and hire women journalists all over the world. And they've been doing amazing work forever. I think they're closing in a couple of weeks, but they also have great kind of language guide to think about non-colonial language. And just a side note, then my last question. So New York Times, I pay for New York Times. I'm addicted to Guardian. I don't contribute enough, but Guardian has really good development reporting. I think better than the Times even or Post any other. But there was a podcast I heard yesterday in the Times. I haven't read the article yet, but about a journalist who teamed up with a Nigerian journalist, and they looked at the lead recycling. And it's not e-waste, but it's horrifying. Just and this is all over the world, whether it's breaking down ships or electronics. But this was, and it's starting to potentially to changes, but just There's
E-waste,
so
that was
so
the word I couldn't think of a second ago. But yeah, when I went to Ghana, there was these huge dumps of e-waste from,
yeah.
Europe and US, and it was a story that it was a horrifying sight. So I was like, for sure, this is a story. But unfortunately, the feedback was, we want a local journalist, which, I could work with a local journalist in collaboration. Or the story, a lot of places were said, oh, this story's been done before. 5 years ago, we covered it,
Right.
So that's maybe one where it's a case of waiting for like a news hook, a change in policy. And it's still something I have in my notebook. So I'm like, I feel like this can't not be a story.
And it's horrifying because it's all over the world,
Yeah.
exporting trash. Anyway, so
Yeah.
so last question. So any particular movie or show that you've watched, doesn't have to have anything to do with work, that just is occupying your brain that you might encourage others to look at? Doesn't
Oh
have to be like
gosh.
anything about development, just something like you might have watched or seen and just is could be purely entertaining and mindless, or it could be
Oh
deep.
my goodness, no, I can't think of anything from the last
Okay.
few weeks. I'm trying to think, what have I been watching recently? I will say yeah, maybe this is more general. I
Yeah.
live in Spain and I speak Spanish, but it's still not perfect. So I do use Netflix a lot and
Yeah.
I just put on any random thing in Spanish.
Mhm.
So I've been watching a lot of like Argentinian comedy things on
Yeah.
Netflix. So yeah, maybe that's a good way because I feel like it switches off my mind at the same time as it works a different part of my brain because it's working
Yeah.
the language side of my brain, but at the same time, it's usually some silly, goofy Netflix series, that
Yeah.
they do. But I feel a little bit better about watching something like that because at
Yeah.
least it's in Spanish and I'm pushing my brain in one way. So um, yeah, gosh, sorry, I can't think of
That's
anything
good.
else off the top of my head, but I would just say that's something I like to do. It's kind of, yeah, like unwinding and you're kind of listening in the background and you're not too involved.
Yeah.
But yeah, so for me, probably just been going through different Argentinian comedy things on Netflix.
Yeah. Yeah, I do that a lot because my spoken Spanish, my comprehension is very good. Spoken is decent. Writing is not, and obviously
Yeah,
Colombia, we have tons of great Colombian series, but there's a lot of good Argentinian ones, and some are on
yeah,
Hulu. There's one called the Encargador, like the Super. It's only on
okay.
Hulu,
Don't know.
and
Okay.
it's very entertaining. Anyway,
Yeah.
so thank you so much for your time and wisdom and sharing. And I'll put in the link, the show notes. It'll have all different resources we talked about to your journal
Yeah, I
portfolio
can.
page.
It's journal portfolio. It's one word. I can send you it just to make sure that you've got the right one. But yeah, if anyone had any like specific questions, or yeah, if I can try and help anyone connect with editors or any, like that, I would also just add that I think being part of groups, even just WhatsApp groups, can be really
Right.
helpful in terms of finding out about. Does anyone know the editor at this place? Or I've got this idea. Does anyone know what kind of place would take this story?
Yeah.
I'm in a group on WhatsApp that's just Barcelona journalists. I guess someone
Mhm.
started it. Now it's got like 40 or 50. And,
Okay.
last week I was asking, has anyone been to the Gambia for a reporting trip? And like so many people jumped in and helped and gave advice or connected me with journalists there. So I think, yeah, don't underestimate like little local
Yeah.
networks of journalists.
Yeah, we have that in Medellin. I mean, I started one, and a friend has another group, and each one has about 120 people, and a lot of it's professional. But someone's like, "I need to go away. Where's a sustainable place to stay?" And so it's like not. So if there isn't a group in your city or town, start it, because then you're
Yeah.
like the hub person.
Yeah. Yeah.
I agree. So thank you so much. Have a good trip to the Gambia. Follow Emma on LinkedIn. Stay tuned follow DevX and subscribe, and then also check out. So that year of end forecast is likely to be out. I mean, there's no pressure, but like
So
next month.
So in the next couple of weeks, there'll be a couple of articles around, yeah, kind of looking at the sectors that have hired most. My colleague Justin did this last year. So like the climate sector,
Mm.
the health sector, looking at a breakdown of the sectors that have hired this year. And then in January, there's going to be, I think, a downloadable that's actually going to look at, because we want to use the full year data. So it'll also
Yeah.
include the December job data. And in January, that will publish kind of looking at the jobs from this year and hopefully making some predictions for hiring next year.
Okay. Thank you so
So
much.
hopefully that helps.